Welcome back to Animation Studies and Practice, and welcome to week 2. The content for the online before class work today is going to focus on Project 1 and the deliverables that are required to be completed by the time the project is due. So let's take a look.
Okay, so the first thing we want to do is jump to Campus Online and open up the unit guide, which I've done here. So I have used the navigational bar at the side to go to the Project 1 brief, which comes up here. Now, we're not going to go through the whole thing in this video. I'm just going to focus on the project goals and talk you through how that would look in an animation timeline format. So let's have a quick read through this. So project goals, focusing on famous practitioners, technology and style, and as part of a small group, you are required to produce a timeline about the specific area of your interest in the animation field. This timeline will be presented to the class live or in a pre-recorded video format. You will complete the following: a 7 to 10 minute in-class or video presentation, a 500 to 1,000 word analysis, an animation timeline, and project reflections. So it sounds like there's a fair bit to do there. However, I'd like you to keep in mind that one part of this project you can use in the others, and that is your 500 to 1,000 word analysis. So this 500 to 1,000 words that you will write on the history of animation, this information is what is added to your animation timeline. Okay, so the information you have here and the information you will eventually include in your timeline should be identical. Something else to note is when it comes time to present your timeline, we don't want you to write a whole new script in order to present your project. What you will do instead is to read out to the class the 500 to 1,000 words you have written for your timeline. Okay, so what we want to avoid is that for the presentation, you write a totally new script or try and rehash the information from your timeline. So instead, the script that you use for your presentation should be that 500 to 1,000 words that you have already written and is included in your animation timeline. I hope that's clear, but of course, you can always check in with your facilitator if you'd like to talk about that in more detail. Okay, so now that we've had a chance to talk through these deliverables, let's take a closer look at what needs to be included in this 500 to 1,000 word analysis. Probably the key thing just to keep in mind at this point is when we say analysis, I think what we're really looking for from you is a series of facts or information about the history of animation. We're not asking you to do a compare and contrast between different events or ideas within the history of animation. Project 1 is really about fact finding and practicing your research skills. So that 500 to 1,000 words, again, it's historical information and mainly description in that way. So our visual timeline. As I said, we've got the project goals, but what we're going to focus on is that 500 to 1,000 words and what it needs to include. So I'm going to break this down and talk you through how the animation timeline will look in as far as how do you divide the information between the different members of your group, and how do you divide up the chunk of history that you have chosen to look at. So the first thing to keep in mind is each person will focus on a different part of animation history. By the way, that 500 to 1,000 words is what each person needs to write. So that's not the whole group's animation timeline. That's just one person writing their part. Okay. We will continue to clarify this throughout the presentation. So just to kick off, each person will focus on a different part of history. So if we have a rough timeline here, let's say we've got 3 members of our group, Finn, Jake, and Marceline, and they're each looking at an early part of animation history. So Finn's looking at the first 10 years of the timeline. Jake's looking at the next 10 years, so 1910 to 1920, and Marceline's looking at the last 10 years. So there's no overlap between the group members in terms of their part of the timeline. Each person has a distinct 10 years that they can have a look at. You can, of course, divide up the amount of time you look at differently in your group. This is purely just an example. The thing I'd like you to take away is that each person looks at a different part and there's no overlap between those parts. Okay, so the next thing is your part of the timeline must include at least 5 items. So let's say we're going to have a look at Finn's part of the timeline, who's looking at that first 10 years. So Finn's 5 items are going to be taken from a range of events over those 10 years. So we have one event in the very first year, then there might be something that Finn talks about in 1904, the second event, then in 1906, 1908, and 1909. Okay, so they're his 5 elements. I haven't obviously explained exactly what he would be talking about. We'll do that in a tick, but this is just to give you an example of how those 5 different items might be spread across that chunk of time that you decide to look at. Of course, you might look at more years than, say, just 10. Again, this is just an example, but I think the thing to take away from this idea is to try and spread out your items across the chunk of time that you are responsible for. Okay, we'll keep going. Next, now, hopefully this is familiar from the brief. So each item on your timeline should focus on one of the following 3 things: aesthetic style, or famous practitioners, or technology. Okay. So I often get students asking me what practitioner means. By practitioner, we just simply mean someone who works within the field of animation. Okay, so here you're getting a bit more information on exactly what you need to write about as part of your visual timeline. So again, sticking with the same student timeline, this is how you might decide to cover these 3 different areas. So what Finn has is chosen a practitioner, probably an animator, that maybe released a film in this year here, then decided to talk about a technology, animation-related technology in 1904, maybe also 1906, another practitioner in 1908, and then a style of animation in 1909. Okay, so this is one way to try and cover all of those 3 themes. The thing is, with your timeline, you want to be covering all 3 of these ideas in your chunk of the timeline. An alternative way to do this is with each item of your timeline to cover or discuss a style, practitioner, and technology. However, at a minimum, I would suggest that you need to cover at least one practitioner, one technology, and one example of style in your whole timeline. And you might choose to sort of assign them this way. Again, this is an example. Okay, so obviously the question you might have is, what are practitioners' technology and style? So first off, we talked a little bit about what a practitioner is, and here's an example. So if you've seen The Iron Giant, then you would know one of the films by this famous animator, Brad Bird. So he's a practitioner and would be a great example to talk about in your timeline. Next, we've got style. Style is sometimes a little bit difficult to define in animation, but one really clear example that we have is the rubber hose animation style, which you can see here from the Silly Symphonies short film, The Skeleton Dance. And finally, an example of technology. So we've got here as an example is Andy Serkis playing the part of Gollum. And the technology we would talk about is the fact that Lord of the Rings was obviously the first film. Lord of the Rings included the first full CGI character, and that's our example of technology. Okay, so they're the couple of different themes that you need to hit as part of your timeline. All right. So just to kind of summarize what each item of your timeline must include. So again, we're going back to Finn's timeline here and just taking a microscope to this item. So each item in your timeline needs to include a specific focus on either style, practitioner, or technology. So in this example here, it's going to be a discussion about a practitioner. Each item on your timeline should include at least 100 words of text. So that means when you write each of your 5 items, you will end up with 500 words of text. Of course, you can write more than that because the bracket is from 500 to 1,000 words. So you might find that your each item is really ranging between 100 and 200 words. In your timeline, you also want to include an image with the event, such as a movie poster, a photo of your practitioner, or maybe a screen grab of a film. So just a bit of a visual artifact to accompany the item. In week 4, when we look at augmented intelligence, which is used as part of this project, I'll show you how to include an image. And funnily enough, your timeline also needs to be accurate. Okay, so just some more details on the timeline overall. You want to make sure you include a reference list according to APA 7 style in your project document. Now, just a reminder, when we're talking about the project document, we are, of course, referring to the template or your version of the template that is provided in Campus Online. So that's that here, okay? So your APA 7 reference list needs to be included at the bottom of your project template, and there is a heading to prompt you to include that there. All the research collected, so your 500 to 1,000 words, will be combined using augmented intelligence in the form of an online timeline generator. Also within that project document, you'll want to take a screen grab of your timeline and include it there, and also include the URL to your project. So that's looking at the timeline in a little bit more detail. I'd like to go into the timeline themes a little bit more. So by that, I mean the practitioner, style, and technology, and give you some examples of what you might write about. So let's start with that practitioner, arguably the easiest one to talk about. So these might be some questions that you answer to help you write a description of your chosen practitioner or practitioners. So first of all, you might tell us who they are and what do they do. For example, are they an animator? Are they a director? Or something else? Number 2, what country or region did they come from? Okay, very often we have famous practitioners that are associated with a certain region or part of the animation industry. So it's interesting to know that. Finally, you could talk about what is it about their work that they are most well known for. Okay, so we've got an example here. It's only part of an example. There would be more to this, but just to show you how you might write about a practitioner. So we've got a practitioner here. the Walt Disney of Eastern Europe, released his first puppet animation. He became an icon for his style and technical developments, as well as his part in bringing stop motion to the mainstream. So we can see here it answers a couple of these questions. It tells us who they are and what they do. So they're a stop motion animator. And it also tells us what they're most well known for, which is, of course, their stop motion and making that, bringing that to the mainstream. You'll also note that just in that discussion, we've also got that in-text reference. Okay, so when you're figuring out what to write about your practitioner, think about trying to answer these questions, and you should be able to easily cover your 100 to 200 words. Okay, let's move on to the next theme, which is technology. So again, we've got some questions here you might try and answer in order to write that timeline item. So what is the technology? How did it come about? Who created or helped to develop it? What was it used for? And what notable projects use the technology? Now, we've got quite a few questions here, and of course, these are just suggestions, like the ones with the practitioner. You might choose to answer a couple of those or all of them, or you might talk about this item of technology in a different way. However, these questions are probably pretty stock standard, and when you talk about a piece of technology, you will undoubtedly cover some of these things. Again, let's have a look at an example. So the first computer-generated animation was used in Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, released in 1958. It was created by John Whitney using a computer made from old anti-aircraft targeting equipment. Okay, so we've answered a couple of those questions here. Who created it? Where that piece of technology was used, and also the time that it came about. Okay, so that's technology. Let's finish off with animation style. So animation style, again, is a little bit tricky to hone in on. Unlike graphic design, which most pieces of work can be fitted into specific styles, animation styles are a little bit trickier to find. So we're going to stick with one that is quite a famous animation style. Another example, which is called rubber hose animation, which we talked about before, and we'll read through this example. But some other examples of animation style might be anime, or even more specifically, post-war anime. Okay, so with animation style, the things you can talk about is discuss the key features of the style, discuss how it came about, who were some of the creators that worked in that style, and what were some key projects that demonstrate the style. So we've got an example here. So the rubber hose animation style is defined by characters that had rubber hose limbs without joints. It was inspired by contemporary comic strips of the time. One of the most well-known examples of animation that demonstrates that rubber hose style is Felix the Cat, created by Pat Sullivan and Otto Messmer. An animation style refined by Bill Nolan. Okay, so again, this example here covers quite a few of these questions. Again, and it is an example, and these questions are suggestions, but hopefully it gives you an idea as to how your item about animation style might sound, or when you're talking about style in your animation timeline, the kinds of things you would talk about. Okay, so last but not least, we should cover some submission details. So the project is due Sunday of week 4. Please note with ANM110 and all of your other units, you must submit every project. If you do not submit a project, you will fail the unit. So yes, this is pretty serious. So just to expand on that, if it's getting to the due date for the project, you might consider applying for special consideration if there is a reason such as sickness or an issue that has prevented you from submitting the project on time. Alternatively, if it gets to the due date and you're not finished, our suggestion as facilitators is to just submit what you have, okay? Because not submitting a project is an automatic fail, you are much better off just submitting your progress so far and then moving on to the next project. Please don't forget your reflections. We will go through these in more detail in coming weeks, but reflections are twice per project. Therefore, you're doing about 6 reflections per trimester because there are 3 projects with 2 reflections each. You must include some research or referencing in your mid-project reflection. And as part of the video for next week, we are going to talk about how to do the mid-project reflection. And then finally, you get 1 supplementary task chance per trimester, but you have to submit it to get this opportunity. Okay, so they are all the details of the animation timeline. What we're going to do now is just talk about the additional pre-class work that you want to try and work through before you get to your session this week. Okay, so just quickly, the rest of the pre-class work you will find under weekly content and the second tab here, research strategies. So if we scroll down past the main topics and go to the before class content, the 2 things that are most important to do this week are the first video, which will talk about identifying keywords which you can use for your Google searches or using in the SAE library search engine. And the second one that's really critical is to have a look at this reading that is provided here, which is the World History of Animation, Chapter 1. Specifically, you want to just have a look at pages 12 to 21. So just a heads up that this particular chapter has been divided up over weeks 2 and 3, and we're just having a look at the first half this week. Okay, and that's everything. So good luck with the rest of your week, and I hope you are able to make a positive start to your animation.